Thank you for joining SNTC today, and I will start by introducing our moderator, Dr. David Ashkin.
Karen, thank you very, very much. How are you doing up in Gainesville today, or for most people down in Gainesville today?
It's terrific here, beautiful weather.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Hey, I want to welcome everybody today. I know I say this, but this is really going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be a great presentation, something that we're all excited for. I have to say, it seems like it was just yesterday we were all together, us in the TB community. I kind of like to say that because we truly are a community. One of the nice things about TB for me is the close collaboration, the camaraderie that we all have, and we all share a passion of TB. Matter of fact, a lot of people that I work with, they call us the TB nerds. I don't know if you get that. At first, when people would call me a TB nerd, it kind of bothered me a little. But, after a little while, I kind of enjoyed it, and I think it's really true. I think we just have this passion, all of us, in TB. And, I was thinking about this, in other communities, they get together too, you got the people getting together at Comic-Con, or you have your Trekkies getting together for Star Trek, Well, this is kind of our TB Con, and the reason I'm really excited today is that we kind of have our Captain Kirk of the Trekkies or the TBs, here with us today. We're really going to have a treat today. We have an exciting presentation with Dr. Reichman. Lee Reichman, you all know. I mean, how could you not know him if you know TB, He's going to be talking about something I think is really interesting, and I think every so often we have to stop, especially when we're in points in time, to stop and see where we are, where we've been, and where we need to go. And I think that's what this presentation is going to be about. I also think what I'd really like to encourage you guys is that Lee is going to be talking about something that I think is near and dear to us and something in many issues that really concern us. And we want to welcome you, and just like Karen said before, we want to make sure you can ask questions. So please, during the presentation, if you have a question, put it into that Q&A in the right, or better yet, if you want to ask Lee your question live, in person, please just put in the chat or in the QA that you want to ask a question. Just put your name, and then at the end of the presentation, I'll tell you how to unmute yourself so you can ask Lee a question. But we're just so excited, and we really want to make this as interactive as possible. Also, I just want to tell you, as we're going to be talking about the U-shaped curve of concern, an editorial that really, for me at least, really influenced me a lot. And for those of you who don't have the editorial, in the bottom right, you'll see the handout section. And the SNTC has arranged with the American Journal of Respiratory and Critical Care Medicine to actually distribute some for those individuals who don't have it. And please, we have a limited amount, but if you don't have the editorial and like to download it, you can download it in the bottom right where it says handout. So, if you need it, please go ahead. And other than that, let's get started. So I have to tell you that I always like this quote, and it says that the only thing new in the world is the history you don't know, Harry Truman. And I got to say that when I was a whippersnapper starting in TB, I didn't appreciate it. And over the years, I really have come to appreciate this quote. And I really think it's a great kind of, setting for what we're going to talk about today. I think we'd agree, for those of us who are in TB, all of us look at these curves like this, and we get in the habit. I mean, every year, each one of us, especially around World TB Day, that, as you know, just happened a couple of weeks ago, we kind of look at these graphs, and let's be honest, at least for me, over the last 10, 15 years, I got used to seeing that curve going downward. It would be going down by, 5 to 7% decreases. We were talking about all of the successes we had, but at the same time, we were also starting to talk about, what were we going to do, how were we going to make changes, considering that the incidence of disease was really starting to go down, But interestingly enough, the bottom line came down to is that last year we saw something that we weren't accustomed to in Florida. We actually saw, instead of it slowing down, instead of it going down, it actually started going up. And as a matter of fact, this year, we actually reported the largest increase in percentage of cases in Florida that we've seen in over 15 years. And not only, if you look at not only just Florida, but if you look at the United States, that curve that was going down so nicely is now starting to level out. And this really starts to concern us, And what I kind of found is in discussions with other states, I found that others were also experiencing the same thing, and that we really started to think about this. And as I was looking at that curve, it kind of reminded me of another curve, a curve that I'd been lecturing about and added to most of my lectures on TB for the last 25 years, and that was this U-shaped curve of concern. And I have to say, looking at those numbers from Florida and the United States has started to haunt me. And I really started to think about, what was going on. Was our future starting to be predicted? Back in 1993, I made a decision to join this TB community and make TB my career. And I think you'd agree, myself, I'm sure others have done the same thing. When you start in TB, you start like ravaging that you eat through articles. You can't get enough information, to try to find out, what was TB all about. And I started reading all of these articles by the fathers of TB, the Kochs, the Linnecks, the Foxes, the Mitchisons, the Comstocks, the Steads, the Eismans, the Sabaros. And in reading and facing trying to understand the challenges that Florida was having with TB, I came upon an article that really started to strike me. It was an article by Karen Brubney and Jay Dobnik from New York that started to really describe what was happening in New York. That in New York, in Harlem Hospital in 1991, as Lee will discuss, we were seeing 89% of patients who were started on TB never completed it. And we started to see what was almost horror, the very, very like a horror picture, when it came to tuberculosis, And this article, I have to be honest with you, was dramatic in its findings, and I believe extremely brave in what it was saying. These authors were not afraid to admit what was going on and to really point out what the real problems with TB was. What I always thought was interesting about that article was accompanying it was this editorial about a U-shaped curve of concern. And this is actually the original article. I still have it in my records that I had from back in, this is 1993, and I highlighted all these points. And I remember, it's funny, I looked at it through the other day, I underlined this guy, Lee Reichman, and I was really impressed with what he was saying in this slide. He was making the case that the severity of TB in the United States and the world was something that really was something that we could actually potentially control. But that he foresaw, he started to predict that even though we might have successes, what would happen is that with those successes, the number of cases would go down, which is great. But he started to predict 25 years ago, and I don't want to get into this. I know we have this whole big thing. To me, it's 25 years ago. It was in October. I'm not good with math anyway. But the bottom line is he predicted 25 years ago that as the number of cases would go down, something else would go. And that would be the concern by the public, the concern by our authorities about TB. And he started to predict that he was fearful that if that went down, that what happened was TB would come back. So, this article, this editorial really, really changed my perspectives. And actually, that's what really inspired me. Every time I spoke about TB, I always would end my lectures with that U-shaped curve of concern to really remind people that we really have to be worried about what would happen and that we shouldn't be overconfident. And that's why what I'm really happy to do today is bring Dr. Reichman here. Lee has really been an amazing force in tuberculosis. Few times do we have the ability to share the expertise of somebody who's really changed our careers. Lee has been advocating for TB since the 1970s. He's been discussing the perils of TB and what was needed to stop it. He's literally been a wolf howling in the woods, trying to warn all of us about tuberculosis and what we needed to do. What I really respect about Lee, he's done everything when it comes to TB. He's run TB programs, the New York City TB program. He started a model center. He's published hundreds of articles and editorials. He's given thousands of lectures, spoken to numerous medical associations. He's even provided testimony before the U.S. Congress, trying to explain to them what would be necessary to control tuberculosis. He's been a leader in the American Lung Association, the American Thoracic Society. He's even won the union's Medal of Honor, the highest recognition. He's written books. He's had articles written about him. He's been on TV. He's been on internet. And let's be honest, guys. Come on. How many of you guys, how many of us have actually a book on Amazon? I mean, about tuberculosis. Come on. That's really making it. He's all over the internet. Maybe sometimes maybe in ways that he doesn't want. Lee, have you been arrested? I just saw this. I hope not, but I'm trying to find the $20 to find out. But the bottom line is he's all over. And Lee is truly the king of all TV media, if there is such a thing. And I believe there should be such a thing as this. He's part of the TV Hall of Fame. You know, I have to tell a funny story. After reading the editorial, Lee became kind of a celebrity to me, you know. And I don't know about you, but other people want to meet their celebrities. You know, people want to read, you know, they want to meet their sports stars. They want to meet their rock stars, their movie stars. I wanted to meet my TV star. And I remember back in 1993 when I was first taking, you know, starting to learn about TV, there was a conference up in Washington. And I took my wife and at the time my 1-year-old daughter up to Washington. I remember it being like 5:30. My daughter's all really tired. We just finished a conference. I quickly called my wife, asked her to bring my daughter in, and we went hunting. And maybe today you would call it stalking Lee. And I still remember, you know, finding Lee, introducing him to my kids, and it's something I'll always remember, you know. And the bottom line is that, yeah, I was really struck that, 10 years after that, Lee writes a book. You know, and this is the craziness of me. You know, I'm thinking, you know, Lee writes a book. You know, like all other celebrities, if he writes a book, you have to have a book tour. And I actually set up a book tour for Lee in Florida. You know, we actually, you know, if you're going to have Lee anywhere, just a hint, you got to have barbecue. We had barbecue, and it was really amazing. And one of the things that I think is most funny about it is like any celebrity, what do you got to do? When you see a celebrity, right, you got to get an autograph. And this is Lee actually autographed my book, though I think he made me pay for the book. I don't remember now. But I even think what's funny about this, the autograph he gave me, is something I still cherish. Even in the autograph, even in the beginning where he's talking about, you know, nice things, he still gets on my case like he always does, that I'm not doing enough. I'm not getting out there. I'm not advocating enough. You know, but that's Lee. And that's why Lee has been such a powerful, force, you know. So, you know, he's been a mentor of mine. You know, he's inspired me, and that's what's great about the TV community, that we are surrounded by people like him that spur us on. And that's why I have to be honest with you. You know, when all this news was coming out again about decreasing declines and that we wouldn't be able to reach elimination by the end of the decade, you know, that one voice came to my mind, and I thought it would really be important to really hear Lee's perspective. You know, Lee Reichman is a professor of medicine and epidemiology at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School in Newark, New Jersey. After receiving his medical degree from New York University in his first year of residency at and earned a master in public health at Johns Hopkins School of Hygiene and Public Health. Dr. Reichman served as Director, Bureau of TB Control and Assistant Commissioner of Health at the New York City Department of Health. Subsequently, he joined the faculty at the College of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey, now Rutgers. He's now he was the director of Pulmonary Division there. He was a founding executive director of the Global TB Institute, our sister partner in the fight against tuberculosis. He's been there for over 21 years, and he continues to share his extensive TB expertise as a senior advisor to the Institute. Dr. Reichman has published over 200 articles, scientific reviews, and book chapters about TB, and has served on general national and international committees, advisory boards, professional organizations, and societies, including the U.S. Advisory Council for the Elimination of TB, the International Union Against TB and Lung Disease, or what we call the Union, the American Lung Association, American Thoracic Society, and the World Health Organization Stop TB Partnership. And he was a founding member of the Advocacy and Communication Working Group. Hey, bottom line is, Lee's a true leader of TB, and especially in fashion. I mean, you got to love those bow ties. He's a mentor, and I know he's a great friend to public health. Today, Lee is kind enough to share his wisdom with us on where we are on the U-shaped curve of concern 25 years later. Lee, it's my tremendous honor to introduce you. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Well, thank you, David. That was probably the nicest introduction ever.
When do I get that?
And the introduction was so good that it can't possibly be eclipsed by the talk. So maybe we should just skip the talk. but Karen and Donna would be pissed, so here we go. Since we're only 2 weeks removed from World TB Day, I thought I would put a couple of slides in about World TB Day because we all talk about it, but not a whole lot of people know what was behind it. So a couple of slides of that, and this is taken from the book that you so kindly referred to, Time Bomb. The world changed on the evening of March 24th, 1882, when a thin, nearsighted 38-year-old German physician, Robert Koch, read a paper to the Physiological Society in Berlin. On that March evening in Berlin, Koch noted that a seventh of all human beings die of tuberculosis, and if one considers only the productive middle-aged groups, TB carries away a third and even more of these. Reading his brilliant paper through his thick glasses, Koch told his audience that tuberculosis was an infectious disease caused by a bacterium. He spelled out the scientific evidence to prove this in meticulous detail. It was astonishing news. At last, the cause of the disease that had terrified humanity, possibly more than any other disease for millennia, had been identified. When Koch finished his presentation, there was no applause. The audience sat in stunned silence. Koch's news was just as shattering to his listeners as the news that the earth was round, not flat, had been to their ancestors. This was a profound change, a revolution in scientific thinking. The doctors and scientists in that Berlin hall had just heard that the major killer disease of their time was not inherited, it was not mysterious. It was an infectious disease that was spread through the air by bacteria. That meant that one day it might be prevented and cured. Here's the paper. You'll notice the date on the paper, 10th of April. He gave the paper on the 24th of March, so that means that editorial review and was a little faster in those days. World TB Day itself was proposed by the country of Mali in 1991. March 24th, a couple of weeks ago, was the 135th anniversary of the discovery of the TB bacillus, and the Union and WHO and CDC and ATS and GTBI and SNTC, Crusaders Against TB Worldwide, celebrate that day to call attention to the embarrassing fact that TB will kill more people in 2017 than in 1882 when Koch discovered the bacillus. Now let's talk about what you asked me to talk about. I'm going to start, excuse me, I'm going to be clearing my throat a lot, and I hope you don't mind. In early 1991, I was asked by the editor of the then American Review of Respiratory Disease, Robert Plokey of Buffalo, New York, to write an editorial to accompany an article that I had very favorably reviewed, Karen Brudney and Jay Dobkin, Research in Tuberculosis in New York City. I humbly accepted Dr. Plokey's invitation, and after several fits and starts, thought back to a talk I'd given in 1972 at the National Communicable Disease Conference held in Houston. And I entitled the talk, TB Incidence, a Prism Through Which to View Deficiencies in Healthcare. And I used the talk to ultimately pen the editorial that Dave talked about, the U-shaped curve of concern, which was published in October 1991, a bit more than 25 years ago. And I really sincerely thank Dave Askin for calling this anniversary to my attention, because I had no idea. And so in this talk, I'll review Brudney and Dobkin's original paper and their findings, my editorial, and then bring it up to date with some lessons learned today. So here's from Brudney-Dobkin's article. Reported TB cases in New York City have been increasing since 1979. Remember, this was written in 1991. The epidemic of infection with HIV is often blamed for this resurgence. Significant social, economic, and historical factors contributed to increasing tuberculosis rates several years before the full force of HIV was felt, and the growth of homelessness among urban drug abusers in the 1980s paralleled the spread of HIV infection, greatly complicating tuberculosis treatment and probably promoting further spread. So Brunny and Dobkin analyzed the cohort of 224 consecutive patients who had been recently admitted to Harlem Hospital, and 53% were alcoholic, 64% were injecting drug users and or crack cocaine users, 68% were homeless or unstable housing, and 50% were HIV infected. And ultimately, of those 224, 178 patients were discharged on treatment for TB. And of those, 159 or 89% were lost to follow-up, failing to complete therapy. And of these 89%, 48% were readmitted within 12 months with confirmed active TB. 40% of these were discharged on treatment, and another 35 were lost. Again, from the article, Central Harlem had been the area in New York City with the highest rate of TB since well before 1960, having seen a more dramatic increase in TB than any other area, and it's been an area of unemployment, poverty, high rates of drug, alcohol abuse, and AIDS. They prospectively studied all patients with TB admitted to Harlem Hospital. All inpatients at Harlem Hospital Center with suspected or confirmed TB were evaluated, and only patients with N tuberculosis, culture confirmed, were included. TB was diagnosed, as we said, in 224 patients. The time frame was January through September 88. They were 79% male, 53% alcoholics, 68% homeless, 82% unemployed, 26% previously treated for TB. Nearly all stated they never completed treatment, and 2/3 reported HIV risk factors. 80% were positive for HIV. Of the patients who discharged, 178, and 46 had died during hospitalization. But of those discharged, as we said, 89% failed to complete treatment, 99 never returned for outpatient follow-up, 49 failed to complete 3 months of treatment, 19 patients, or 11%, were cured or died of other cases while on treatment or remained on therapy till the end of the study period. Within 12 months of discharge, 27% of the patients were readmitted, that's 48, all with confirmed active TB at least once, and almost all of those discharged were again lost to follow-up, with 20% admitted a third time. Also from the article, they gave a historical perspective on handling TB in New York City, and they described the special task force appointed by Mayor Lindsay, John Lindsay, in 1968, which published a comprehensive report dealing with strengths, weaknesses, and future priorities of the New York City TB program. And that task force had recommended early, and this was 1968, remember, earlier discharge, elimination of 100 TB beds annually, because there were lots of TB beds, and an expanded, effective outpatient program that would have $18 million a year to spend by 1973, given the closure of 500 beds by that time. Clinic hours should be adjusted to the needs of the patient, and including trained residents of poverty areas in clinics as home care staffs, providing domiciliary care and chronic disease care facilities and appropriate living quarters for the TB patients who need them, and also integrate the care of TB drug addicts and TB alcoholics into the developing community programs for addiction and alcohol control. So that was one task force. And 10 years after the Lindsay Task Force report was issued, there was a fiscal crisis in New York. The nearly 1,000 designated TB Reds earlier were virtually gone. The private sector now diagnosed more than half of the TB cases, and the combined city and state expenditures for the outpatient activities so strongly recommended 10 years earlier were less than $2 million. So what do? They had another task force. And in 1980, another task force was appointed, this time by the Council of Lung Associations. There were, believe it or not, 4 lung associations in New York at the time. And that task force reported, quote, "It must be strongly suspected that the increase in newly reported cases in New York City is in part the result of fiscal neglect of the TB problem in the state's largest city. The resurgence of the disease, a bitter reversal of the expected trend, is related to a failure of both health authorities and government at all levels to muster a public health program." Still quoting, "At federal, state, and local levels, public health funds allocated to TB are inadequate, in some instances so grievously inadequate as nearly to amount to dereliction and default of legal mandate. And New York City's fiscal crisis in the mid-1970s led to a drastic cut in appropriations for all public health programs." I don't know how many people in the audience are used to reading task force reports and politically written things, but this is pretty strong stuff. So New York City has progressively cut back its contract. New York State has progressively cut back its contract, terminating it entirely as of September 79. Federal support by the Public Health Service grants decreased 80% from $1.4 million to $283 million in 1980. The previously suggested dramatic decrease in beds and inpatient days had been accomplished, but outpatient expenditures were cut. None of the outpatient services recommended by the earlier task force were being offered, and the number of health department chest clinics had been cut from 22 to 9. And since the mandated staff increases had not occurred, neither public health nurse home visits nor home health aid home visits were taking place. And that's what we now call the OT workers. The number of contacts identified per TB case had also dropped. And drug treatment programs to which patients reported daily for their methadone had received no impetus to screen or treat patients for tuberculosis. In 1980, while this was going on, the federal government funded a new pilot project called the Supervised Treatment Program in response to the increasing number of TB patients failing to complete treatment. And a group of patients was identified who were clearly at high risk for treatment failure. The program mandated daily visits to the homes of patients who met these criteria with direct observation of the patient ingesting his or her medication, and this program had a 90-95% success rate. But unfortunately, the federal government failed to increase funding to enable expansion, and neither the state nor the city contributed significantly to enlarge its scope in the intervening years. So the conclusions of Brudney and Dobkin were: the resurgence of TB in the AIDS era is surrounded by ironies. Increasing potent anti-tuberculosis agents are powerless to overcome massive noncompliance. Tuberculosis, among all serious complications of AIDS, stands out simultaneously as both the most curable and the most contagious to the HIV-negative population. Regaining control of epidemic tuberculosis will be difficult and will require effective approaches to hardcore issues also common to the AIDS epidemic: poverty, homelessness, and substance abuse. And the AIDS epidemic has created a severe financial stress on the healthcare system in many communities, but it would be a mistake to divert vital resources to AIDS activities from essential public health programs like tuberculosis control. So this is all taken from Budney Dobkin's article, and a lot of those thoughts, as you might agree, are highly prescient. So this led to the editorial. So here's now from the editorial, and I'm no longer quoting Budney and Dobkin. The rise in TB and in New York, and by analogy other urban areas of the U.S., is not only due to the HIV or homeless problem usually cited by the media. It reflects the total failure of a public health system. And the Budney-Dobkin experience precisely reflects what seems to be a ubiquitous occurrence in public health practice. First, evaluation indicators of a public health program show improvement, leading to diminishment of compelling need. Then the resources providing the fuel and direction to the program are removed. And finally, the incidence of disease controlled begins to rise in proportion to the diminished resources. And this phenomenon has been called by me the U-shaped curve of concern. So here's from Budney-Dobkin. This is the figure that appeared there. The open bars are Harlem, and the shaded bars are New York City, and the closed bars, shaded bars, are Harlem. And you can see it looks like a U. If you look, the rates on the vertical axis is from 200 to 0, and the years are on the horizontal axis. Here's the figures that were in the editorial. One is, the top one is U.S., and the bottom one is New York City. And here, the editor refused to let me put this in because he said they didn't have enough room, so I put it in this talk anyway, so you can see what we simple-minded people make it look like a U. So back to the editorial, Budney-Dobkin documented that the rise in TB rates in their centers largely caused by the failure of the system. Although the knowledge and technology to reverse the trend have been readily available, this is really the state of TB control in the U.S. in the 1990s. The problem is amply defined and well documented, and the solution attainable with dedication, resources, and commitment. Many programs have long demonstrated they have the dedication. Unfortunately and urgently, we still await the resources and commitment. So to finish up, let's look at current numbers. And this was from World TB Day's release of United States numbers, March 24th, MMWR. And the United States, 2015 last year, had 9,546. This year, 9,287, a drop, but the percent change was only 2.7%. So I think David mentioned in his introduction that the rates went up, and we said, oh, the U-shaped curve's going up. This is a drop-off of 2.7%. Up until this time, every year they had a drop was 5 or 6%. Since we're talking about from Florida, although I'm in New Jersey, but since a lot of you people are in Florida, I thought I'd stick Florida on here. 2015, 602, 2016, 639. That was a rise of 6.1%. And that's case count. Incidence is a drop of 3.4% to historical low of 2.9 in the U.S. but Florida went up 4.3%. The incidence rate is now 3.1%. So in 2016, a total of 9,287 new TB cases were reported in the U.S., the lowest number on record, and a 2.7% decrease. So, people say, oh, it's the lowest on record, although the decrease is also very disappointing. State-specific TB incidence in 2016 ranged from 0.2 cases per 100,000 people in Wyoming to 8.3 per 100,000 in Hawaii. 12 states, Alaska, Arkansas, California, Florida, Georgia, Hawaii, Maryland, Minnesota, New Jersey, New York, North Dakota, and Texas, and the District of Columbia reported a higher incidence than the national incidence. 4 states, California, Florida, New York, and Texas, reported more than 500 cases each, and together, that's more than 50% of the reported cases. U.S.-born cases were 31.6%, and 67.9% were in foreign-born persons. TB incidence among U.S. persons, which was 1.1 per 100,000, decreased 8.4%, but incidence among foreign-born people decreased 3.2%, but was 14 times higher than the incidence among U.S.-born persons. The top 5 countries of origin for foreign-born people reported for TB disease in the U.S. were Mexico, 18%, 19%, Philippines, almost 13%, India, 9.4%, Vietnam, 7.9%, and China, 6.1%. Cases in people born in these countries accounted for 55% of all cases among foreign-born persons. Almost 6% had documented HIV co-infection. 4.6% of patients were homeless in the year preceding diagnosis. Almost 2% were reported as residing in the long-term care facility, and 3.5% were reported as being confined to a correctional facility. In 2015, 88 cases of multi-drug-resistant TB occurred, and among the 88 multi-drug-resistant TB cases, 72 of them, or 81.8%, occurred in persons with no reported prior history of TB, which means they're being spread person to person. And 1 case of extensively drug-resistant TB was reported. So let's pull this all together so we can have some discussion. Lessons for today. Last year on World TB Day, CDC released ominous new data showing that TB was on the rise for the first time in more than 2 decades. This year, the cases and rates are down slightly, but have risen in 18 states, including Florida. The rise of TB in these states, and perhaps the slowing of the decrease, shows that the U-shaped curve may be rearing its ugly head. Again, as the incidence of disease plummets, the program's eliminated rather than the disease, and a graph of the incidence resembles the letter U. TB, as we all know, is an airborne communicable disease caused by a bacterial infection. While it's curable in the vast majority of cases, it can be fatal without proper treatment. Globally, according to WHO, it's passed AIDS as the largest infectious disease killer. And the last time TB rates rose significantly in the U.S. was in the late 1980s to early 1990s. Before then, TB rates had been falling nationally every year since states began reporting. Even though warned by advocates, Congress declared victory, cut funding, and the labor-intensive but cost-effective programs that had sustained the drop were abolished. Just as the U-shaped curve predicted, national TB rates surged between 1985 to 1992, and this was the largest rise in any industrialized country ever, 20% in adults, 35% in children. And this unprecedented resurgence was attributed to the perfect storm of HIV/AIDS infection, an increase in cases in the homeless and foreign-born, and increased transmission among people in the U.S., all at a time of funding cuts to control TB. But the next year, as you all remember, hundreds of millions of federal dollars had to be appropriated to reverse these new case increases. And since then, the national TB rate's been falling by about 5% a year until it reached a historically low level in 2016. But the fall has slowed after last year's increase. This year it's only 2.7%. Predictably, even with that fall, has become complacency, diminished attention, flat funding for TB, and the federal sequestration of funds a couple of years ago. According to a survey by the National TB Controllers Association, 60% of public health TB programs have been forced to eliminate staff, and 25% have restricted key activities, reducing their capacity to respond to TB outbreaks. The recent tragedy of the Flint, Michigan water supply is the most visible reminder of how tenuous public health can be. Just as we're seeing with TB, politicians cut public health programs to save money, which inevitably leads to an emergency that is more costly to fix than prevent in the first place. Now CDC has announced that TB is on the rise again in the U.S., at least in 18 states, and the national decrease in cases totally was only 2.7%. When will our policymakers learn the simple truth that cutting public health essentials like water supply or TB control invariably requires fixing that is far more expensive than the savings from the original funding cut? How many more people need to contract tuberculosis before we focus and sustain sufficient resources on eliminating the disease, not the public health programs fighting it? So that's the last slide. Thanks all very much for your attention. Sorry for my voice. And turn it back to Dave.
Lee, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I really can't thank you enough. So, Lee, let me ask you a question. I mean, I have to be honest with you. When I read the original article by Dr. Brudney and Dr. Dawkins, it really struck me as such a eye-opening event. What was when you read that article? I know you were initially asked to review the article. What made you want to write the editorial?
Well, the article blew me away, and I probably said that in the anonymous reviewer was invited to write the editorial. You know, if you're a young faculty member, you don't say, "Hey, I want to write an editorial." Although maybe there was a box that said, "Does this need an editorial? And if so, would you write it?" I can't remember because some journals have that. But I was very honored to be able to write it, as I said at the beginning. Then I was stuck. I said, "Hey, I have to say something worth writing." So I gave it a lot of thought, and I was very lucky because people remember it.
I agree. I mean, it definitely.
But I think that was remarkable was that as I said in one point earlier, I think that was sort of remarkable was that people called a spade a spade. You know, the author said this is a disaster, this is terrible, and that really needed to be said. Although the history after that article was published is funds were cut. Funds were cut.
But what's interesting, I think you'd agree, because of that article, it brought a lot of attention. And what we started to see is the beginnings of, first of all, recognition that we needed to do better. And you really start to see the whole, the pillars of changes in programs occur. We're so lucky today. Actually, Dr. Karen Brudney is actually on the phone, and she's joining us today. And she's agreed to actually share some of her perspectives. Dr. Brudney, if I'm correct, you're now the director of the HIV clinic and the TB clinic up in at the Presbyterian Hospital in New York. And what I love about it is you're still doing improving treatment adherence. Is that correct? And Dr. Brudney, if you would just push hashtag 6, we'll be able to hear you. Dr. Brudney, are you there?
Can you hear me?
We can. Hey, first of all, welcome and thank you. We can't thank you enough. First of all, we can't thank you enough for the work you did, as well as we can't thank you enough for sharing some of your perspectives today. So, how are you doing up there? I hope you're surviving the cold. I mean, that's being said from somebody sitting in Palm Beach right now.
Not cold today.
Good for you. So let me ask you, Dr. Brudney, I have to be honest with you. I agree with Lee 100%. When I read that article, it was just brave. I mean, it was just brave. The stuff you said was brave. What made you, first of all, think about writing it? What were you observing, and then what gave you guys the courage?
Well, first I want to thank Lee for that unbelievably flattering introduction and spending all that time on this paper. I really had no idea that this was happening until yesterday, and I really appreciate it, Lee. Nobody could ask for a better praiser than you.
Thank you, Karen.
What made me write it was that it was unbelievable that this is what was going on. I was doing my ID fellowship in Harlem Hospital, and I was watching people die, and not just occasionally, a lot. And so it was Jay who kept nudging me. He said, if you're so angry and you're so upset, document it. And if it hadn't been for his mentorship and pushing me, I'm not sure that I would have been well enough organized to do it. It was certainly the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I mean, I had to track down all those patients. This was, you have to remember, pre-electronic record, pre-internet, pre-everything. It was hundreds of thousands of hours of dirty charts and dirty storage rooms trying to find these guys.
Dr. Brudney,
the numbers spoke for themselves. I mean, it was, as Lee said, it was horrifying, absolutely horrifying.
Dr. Brudney, I totally agree. I actually, as I was telling you just a couple seconds ago on the phone, that I actually trained at the City College CCMY 6-year program, and we would actually walk over Morningside Park to get to Harlem Hospital. But, the Harlem that we see today was not what was going on in the mid-1980s.
Oh, no.
Would you take a second and
Morningside Park without
what was happening in Harlem at the time?
Harlem was in the midst of an absolutely horrible heroin epidemic, subsequently followed by an even worse crack epidemic. And the public hospital sector was totally deprived of funding, and Harlem was the worst hit. And I don't think you need to be a rocket scientist to figure out that was a almost 100% African-American community and a 100% African-American hospital. And, the rest is obvious.
It's kind of interesting to me. I agree with you. I remember walking through Harlem, and we would see the shooting galleries. A matter of fact, people, when we talk about shooting galleries, I don't even think that many of them know what I'm talking about. But during the late 70s, early 80s, heroin was unbelievably on the rise. And what would happen to many of these people is that they had lost their veins. They had been shooting for so long that they no longer had any veins they can shoot up. And they would actually pay people to shoot, to actually shoot them up. And it was the first time I had ever seen an internal jugular being shot. Was on my walk to City College at the time, seeing it in a stairwell. It was shocking, And then for a little while, and the reason I'm bringing this up, heroin and crack were really ruling the day. and then heroin went away. And I just want to keep bringing it back to perspective of today. It is kind of a little ironic that 25 years later, we're back with an opiate epidemic again. Dr. Brudney, I know you're dealing with patients with HIV and TB still. What is your? I mean, it is kind of a little weird that we're back to where we were as far as the setting of the stage and the soil that we're now starting to see get nurtured again.
Well, it's a very different epidemic because, I'm pleased that it's finally being treated as a public health problem rather than a criminal justice problem. I suspect, again, that part of the difference is racial. But, there's all this brouhaha about how did we end up locking up all of our African-American young men? Well, that's how we ended up doing it. The opioid epidemic today is serious. I think it will require appropriate substitution therapy and mental health counseling, et cetera, et cetera. I'm hoping that we don't make the same mistake we made 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and treat it as a crime. But under this current administration, federal-wise, I'm not overly optimistic.
And let me ask you a question. I mean, obviously I hear in you that what I love about you is that you have a very strong opinion. So I'd like to ask you this question. After you published that paper, did you find that you got any kind of, let's say, repercussions for publishing the paper?
Only good ones.
Yeah, that's good
Honestly,
news.
I can really say only good ones.
You know that article really changed and opened up a lot of eyes of many programs around. I mean, I think you'd agree. What I loved about what you did in that paper is bluntly, you just said it's not okay. That 89% loss of patients with TB is not okay. And then what you did, which was very, very bold, and I just wanted to know kind of, what made you do that. You went back to history again, and that's what I loved. And you actually started saying, hey, this is what we did, and kind of this is where we went wrong. And then you screamed out we need a call to arms. Is that the correct perspective? Is that kind of what you were thinking about when you wrote that?
Yes, that's absolutely what I was thinking about. I believe in history. I think if you don't understand the mistakes and the good things that were done in the past, you can't move forward. And I, philosophically, profoundly committed to an historical perspective. It's interesting the direction you're taking in your questions. I thought you were going to go back to what Lee was talking about in terms of the problems we're having today with TB control.
Oh, we're going there right now. I just wanted to get your perspective to set the stage.
Oh, okay, because I think that the numbers and the data that he just called to our attention points in the direction of, we need to reach out to the immigrant communities. I mean, the data's been there for years that the overwhelming majority of tuberculosis in the United States is diagnosed in immigrant communities. And, they're here, and we need to reach out to them in a user-friendly way, just like we are now no longer treating heroin opiate addiction as a criminal justice problem. We need to treat the immigrants as not a criminal justice problem, but a public health issue, so that they'll be willing to come in and get diagnosed and treated. Certainly in New York, all politics is local. It's never been a problem. I mean, we've never, ever, ever in the Ministry of Health clinics up here cooperated with any immigration authorities, and patients know that. They know that they're going to get their treatment for free, and that we're not going to ask them any questions about whether they're legal or not legally documented to be here. But I do think that, in the states that are so badly affected now, there needs to be local support, since most public health is locally funded, to outreach these communities in their language, going over the symptoms and signs of tuberculosis and offering free diagnosis and treatment, making it clear, since people are so frightened now because of, what Trump has said, that there will be no repercussions. And that's going to be, if it was difficult 3 years ago, 2 years ago, last year, it's going to be even more difficult now. But it's got to be done, or it's only going to get worse, as Lee said.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what the point, and that's what I would really like to turn to Lee about. I mean, I think right now what's interesting is just a perspective. It's 25 years later. So what have we learned? What has worked, what hasn't worked, and where do we go from now? What challenges face us? Lee, I mean, one of the things that always interests me, was in the first paragraph. The first way you started out the editorial is that you were quoting the CDC and talking about their elimination plan for 2010. And, to kind of jump on what was said, I mean, one of my concerns is that, now, if I'm correct, and I'm really bad at dates and times, but I think we're beyond 2010, and I don't think TB has been eliminated. In your opinion, what do you think what happened? Where did we have successes, and where did we not hit our mark?
Well, I think the big problem, and I see this over and over again, and I hate to say it, but I think it's an us and them problem. Many years ago, when I was the chief of pulmonary at University Hospital in Newark, anytime there's a story about TB in the New England Journal or JAMA, which automatically goes out on the wire services, you get local television stations want to do some B-roll. They want to see some patients and to back up the report on the story that they're covering. Doesn't happen too often that there's a national TB story, but every once in a while there is. And I remember clearly that a local television station came out, and I was very excited. Maybe get on television for a second. And the producer's standing there with me, and they said, go to patient A. They interview patient A. They interview patient B. And the producer comes over to me and says, don't you have any white people with tuberculosis? And I said, no. Swear to God, true story. And I said to the producer, these are our patients. And unfortunately, TB affects disproportionately minorities. In those days, it was AIDS patients. And just beginning to see the foreign-born. And I think we've demonstrated by the events of the past 6 months that the mindset in the general United States and the mindset of the people who appropriate the money is more that, us versus them. And I am getting less and less sanguine that things are ever going to change. And the other thing I should say is I think it was in the North American region meeting, maybe somewhere else, that there was, talking to a program director of a TB program, that the connection of TB and the foreign-born is a very troubling connection, just because foreign-born people are becoming pariahs due to the way that they're being looked at. And unfortunately, that can also be an issue, because you might want to call attention to the fact that TB is rising in the foreign-born as usual, but it's sort of as a two-edged sword, because you don't want to do any damage. These people need support, not pariahship.
Let me ask you a question, though, Lee, and Dr. The bottom line comes down to is that TB has always been an us versus them. It's kind of interesting. When TB was affecting Europe in the 16 and 1700s, and 1 out of every 3 individuals died, it didn't matter who you were. You were susceptible to TB, or at least you were vulnerable to TB. I think you'd agree. I mean, if you look at the last 30 years, TB is a very us and them. I mean, it just, the us's and them's just change. But like Karen pointed out a minute ago, it's gone from, African Americans who are HIV positive, who are homeless, who are drug users, to now foreign-born. But it's always been like that. And, I guess the question comes down to is what this is kind of about is, how do you address that? In an advocacy role, at the same time, you really got to be careful about politics too. I mean, it's about addressing the truth of public health, that public health is often an us and them and haves not. But at the same time, we have a role to do, and we have to do within a political system. Lee, any insights in your 25 years of how to do that?
It's really very troubling. What you do is you disproportionately jump upon the white middle-class person with tuberculosis. Why was Andrew Speaker a household name? I mean, you never think that any TB patient ever would be a household name, but everybody knew who Andrew Speaker was because he was a white middle-class guy with tuberculosis. And if you look back at the AIDS epidemic, AIDS and TB was around for a while until the prison guard, I think it was in Syracuse, died of drug-resistant TB. And he happened to be a white guy. So immediately he became recognized to everybody and brought the attention that TB can affect anybody and does affect anybody. Yeah. And I don't know how to solve the problem.
It's kind of interesting. Internationally, I think you'd agree. I mean, where it's obviously more prevalent, they've done a better job, but I think because their epidemic is different. But, I'm going to open it up. We have a couple questions, but I wanted to ask one other question of you and both of you. I mean, what's interesting is that, history seems to be beginning to repeat, and a lot of terms that we haven't used in a long time that were facing us in the 1990s seem to be coming back. Terms like block grants and, and we're hearing about, other, political, sequestration. I mean, what was your perspective with block grants, and what would be recommendations on, of either educating, advocating, for what the potential perils might be?
You think that educating and advocating is going to work and be effective, and I think the big difference now between now and maybe 26 years ago is I think the TB community knows how to advocate. Plus, we have a whole lot of advocators besides the American Thoracic Society, American Lung Association. We have Results and Action TB and actually grants for advocates. Stop TB USA is at the forefront of all of these things.
What about, for the first time ever, place, where we're getting, some really strong, not only just voice, but also some financial from groups like the Gates Foundation and others?
Yeah, really Gates Foundation actually has a grant, I believe, which is used for advocacy, which is phenomenal. But I think the important thing is that we all need to be advocates, because the time of advocacy, you can't choose. I mean, if you have something unexpected and someone about TB, and someone sticks a microphone in your face, you have to know how to say in 7 seconds what's important. Now, some of my good friends in the TB control community, and you know them as well as I do, Dave, are really afraid that if they're put in that situation and someone puts a microphone in their face and they say, things suck, they'll get fired because their boss doesn't want anybody to think things suck. But if they learn to be media trained, so say everything is under control here with this outbreak, but isn't it a paradox that 135 years after Koch, we have more TB in Florida than we had 135 years ago, or something like that? You've got to be able to learn to say what you got to say so it can't be edited out.
We have a couple of questions that are coming in from the chat. One is from Santa Cruz, California, from Jill, and she was writing that there's been a push in our county for the last 10 years to shift TB treatment for active and even more so for latent TB to the private sector. This decreases our ability to collect data and ensure appropriate treatment. Do you think this is a national trend, and do you think the private sector is prepared to deal with the public health aspects of both TB as well as drug-resistant TB. Lee, want to handle that? I mean, do you think this is something?
Yeah, I think. Well, I think the most. I think a well-trained or cognizant private sector could be an asset, but usually it's not. In my experience, which is in maybe the last 20, 25 years, I mean, people look for excuses not to treat for latent tuberculosis infection. It's much easier not to treat than to treat. I think the real thing that's happening, though, is, and this is another editorial, by the way, but I'll be talking about it at the TB controllers next week, is that we have now really what I think is the holy grail in TB control, is we have EGRAs, so you have accurate diagnosis, and you have the 12-dose regimen, which I hate to say it, but it looks like it doesn't really have to be given under DOT. And
don't say that, Lee.
I know, but okay. But I mean, the 12-dose regimen is even with DOT, is the holy grail. And I think the other thing we need to learn to say, and this is what I'll be talking about next week at the TB controllers, is that the advocates are saying MDR, everybody's afraid of MDR. Isn't MDR terrible? But most MDR cases come from regular TB cases, and they're screwed up by the patient not taking his medicine or the doctor not treating properly, and the doctor not treating properly is probably just as much. Well, if you treat latent infection, regular latent infection, these people don't get active TB and they can't be screwed up. So that's why that's the holy grail, because preventing regular TB prevents drug-resistant TB.
Let me ask you a question, because, one of the issues is the problems with, singing to the choir. So, you're talking about going out to the TB community and the TB conference, but I don't think we need to be convinced. The question I really believe is really important is, how do we get the private sector, especially as I do agree with the Jill, as we're seeing more and more shift to the private sector, how do we get physicians who for years and years and years have been frustrated by 9 months of INH and nobody completing, or, skin tests that they were told were absolutely, the patient would tell them flat out, I don't believe it, I got BCG. How do we overcome, I believe in some ways, our own frustrations as physicians and our experiences of TB in the past, and how do we kind of illuminate them that there is, like you said, a holy grail?
Well, there's a new ball game, and I think the problem is we need to let it be known there's a new ball game. Probably 20 years ago, the CDC came up with this scheme called the National Tuberculosis Training Initiative. And the idea was, this is before model centers even, that they'd get this information in the hands of not the TB community, but the obstetricians and the school health people and people like that. And we get editorials in general medical journals, and this led to the core curriculum. And the core curriculum, which was very helpful. Now, who are the best, in your experience, David, who are the best treaters of latent tuberculosis infection? In mine, it's the rheumatologist, because they suddenly learned, my drugs cause TB, so we got to, and where's most of the publicity? Every time you hear an ad from one of those drugs, they're talking about TB. TB gets more airtime from rheumatology drugs than anything else.
No, I agree with you. I never thought in my career I would ever hear TB on the TV, but you're 100% right. We hear more about tuberculosis on TV because of this than ever before, and I do think those are the opportunities, because, people, while they're watching those commercials like tuberculosis, I thought that was gone, and I think those are the opportunities we have to try to educate. Karen, I heard you jump in, and I jumped in all over Lee there for a second when he started saying that, the 3-HP may be given, by self-administered. As you know, that's a big thing right now. And one of our our listeners, Jennifer is writing, how do you all feel about online DOT for treatment of TB patients in the modern time, or video DOT? Like, one of the big changes I think that have occurred in the last 25 years is technology. And Karen, especially I know with your HIV patients, where we're talking about now not 6 months, but potentially a year, how do you feel about the use of technology or other techniques to try to improve, adherence? And what's been your experience or perspective?
I think ultimately technology is great. I'm, not a complete Luddite about it. But at the end of the day, you're talking about a patient taking drugs, medicines, and a healthcare provider. And it all boils down to the relationship between them. And I guess I'm a big fan of incentives. I've had patients on antiretroviral treatment for years, viral load undetectable, who were crack users or alcoholics, but with minimal incentives, just like we did in the TB program back in the 90s, and decent, humane treatment, all of a sudden, they're quite adherent. I squawked when Lee said that he was, not sure that the 12-dose therapy had to be DOT, only because of my knowledge of human behavior and what, we're all non-adherent. And so I wouldn't want the program of preventive therapy, which I'm a firm believer in, to suddenly fall off the scorecard because we stopped doing DOT for the 12 doses and all of a sudden it looks like it doesn't work anymore. Certainly that's the history of TB treatment, and everybody, the very earliest data came from, frankly, from India, and they held people's hands and gave them food and did this, that, and the other thing and went to their homes every day to give them their medicine under DOT, which wasn't called that then, and it worked beautifully. And then all of a sudden, we expected everybody else to adhere to their treatment, but we weren't going to give them any of those goodies. Not a good idea. Really not a good idea.
Lee, I think
no, I agree with you. I agree. I would like to have a DOT, but unfortunately, the article, which may be published by now, showed you have a 5% adherence loss if you don't give DOT. And even EDOT is less good than no DOT. But the other point was the question of David, what do I think about video DOT? I think that people have to look and see what they're giving. Remember, the DOT is one aspect of taking care of a patient. Exactly. There's another aspect called case management. And I'm still not sure that you can do case management through video DOT. I mean, you mentioned holding the hand. You need someone to hold the hand. You need someone to talk to. And I'm afraid that even though, it seems to be very successful in some hands now who care, if you start giving video DOT to everybody and they become just a number or a cipher, and then we're not going to have that personal contact, and we're going to lose a lot of ground. That's what I'm afraid of.
No, I totally agree with you, Lee, and I guess the bottom line is that most human beings don't like to take pills, period. They don't. And especially if they're not sick, which people getting prophylaxis treatment are not sick. And I guess I feel like, the personal healthcare provider interaction with the patient is absolutely key. And it's not about being a policeman. It's about being supportive. And the only other thing I wanted to bring us back to, Dave, was the whole issue of the incidence of TB among the immigrant population, because I'm really very concerned about that, especially with the current federal administration criminalizing immigrants. And I think this is something that in the TB community, it is our responsibility to advocate for and to take it to a wider audience. We must not criminalize these immigrants with health problems. We must encourage them to come to our facilities, even if they're minimally symptomatic, and let us make the diagnosis and give them free treatment before, the situation gets worse. They give it to household members. I mean, there are 1,000,001 tried and proven educational messages that can go out there, but we need to start doing it. And
I
I'd
agree
rather
with you. I mean, I have to say
that.
We have to walk a very fine line, and I know Lee was kind of critical of this, but I think the bottom line is that, when it comes to public health, just like Lee pointed out with Flint, Michigan and stuff like that, it has to be above politics, and it has to be an education. And we're already starting to see cases where our contact investigations are getting more difficult because of fear that we may come in and, and somehow interfere with their immigration status. And I do think that it really has to be a concerted effort to understand that public health, in order to protect the public, in order to be a true, homeland security like we are, we have to be above politics sometimes. And I think the question is, how do we advocate for, how do we advocate? And that's where, Lee, I kind of wanted to get back for a second, which is that, Lee, one of the purposes of this is to really encourage, the people on the phone to advocate. But I think you'd agree, as important is we need new blood. We need new talent. We need to continue to fight. It got to be passed on to the next generation, For me, people like you and Karen really kind of stimulated me and really encouraged me into a career of TV. But I'm concerned, given everything that's going on, that young, talented people, the people we need, may be afraid to go into a career for TV and especially advocate for TV. Lee, Karen, any kind of pointers or recommendations? How do we encourage? It's funny, Karen, you told me something important. You said you did this while you were a fellow. That's what encouraged you. Lee, any kind of pointers or tips or, suggestions? And how do we encourage people that TV is still an okay career?
No, I think I have to disagree with you a little bit, David, because I think that we're better off with young blood up and maybe they're not there yet. But many years ago, I was thinking, what do I want to do with my life? And I said, I want to go in academic medicine. So I analyzed the situation, and I decided that in academic medicine, you have to be smarter than everybody else or do something no one else does. So I certainly wasn't smarter. So I did TB, and at the time, there were very few of us with two lungs. Remember, TB started in the TB sanatorium, and the joke used to be you'd go to a meeting of the American Trudeau Society and count the number of doctors in the room. That was the number of lungs in the room, because they all were in the sanatorium. They had a lung removed. So when I came up, there was 4 or 5 of us, Hopewell and Heisman, Dixie Snyder, and a few others, and that was all there was. So we got to write all the editorials and give all the talks. Now there's a lot of smart people in TB. There's a lot of new blood. There's a lot of good research going on. And this is another way of getting people coming in who want to compete on that stage and say, gee, these are interesting questions we can ask. It's no longer just take 4 drugs and see in the morning. These are, latency and all of these kind of things. So I think a lot of people are being inspired. A lot of good research is being done. And I think that we're going to be on the upswing with talent, and I won't have to compete with them anymore, which is also good.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. Well said, Lee. Karen, your perspective?
Well, I guess, I've shifted my focus in the last few years, and I'm working much more internationally. I'm now with the CDC a good chunk of my time, and I work mostly in the TB belt in southern Africa, not in South Africa, but in the countries in southern Africa. And, young people get carried away with wanting to have a global health. What I see in these countries is heartbreaking, because they're the countries where the TB burden now is out of control. And the basics of how to run a TB program that, Lee and I know from the Stone Age, they don't really know how to do that. I guess I would encourage young people in training to learn TB back and forth everywhere they can at the relevant places in the United States, and then to try to get involved in teaching, not global health per se, but leadership teaching in these countries, because that's what's needed right now. And I guess I feel pretty passionately about it.
I mean, I agree with you 100%, Karen. I think you touched on a very important point, and which is, don't get me wrong, international is very, very important, but we still need a very, very strong domestic program. And I am worried somewhat, and I've been a little outspoken about this, but I'm worried that we don't have enough training opportunities in most of the United States to learn TB. And especially if you want to go into infectious disease or pulmonary, which our fellows are seeing and our nurses are seeing less and less. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges, is that you really can only do anything in medicine. It's an apprenticeship. The only way to learn is by doing. And my concern is, especially now, is that a lot of the data we rely on is international. And don't get me wrong, while that's very, very important, there's still sometimes subtle differences between what goes on nationally and internationally that may affect our programmatic decisions. So I think you brought up a very good point.
I think one other thing that, training is always in a medical school, in an academic setting. And luckily in New Jersey, in Florida, in New York, the academic centers deal a lot every day, and there's mutual respect with the public health agency and the health department. But in a lot of places that doesn't happen. The TB is a public health disease, and you need to cooperate with the health department to do the DOT and the contact investigation and things like that, because an academic center doesn't do contact investigation or DOT. And so this is a really very important thing that I think needs to be stressed. We have to bring those groups together, as the infectious disease community takes over TB from the pulmonary community always worked with public health. Infectious disease, maybe not so much. And I think that has to change.
Lee, you are still the voice. I agree. You are the voice. And Karen, I got to say, you stimulated all this. We're getting close to the end, and I want to just kind of, ask a couple of questions. So, Lee, I got to tell you some of the depressing things that I have. So in your editorial 25 years ago, you make the point that TB was the leading cause of death from any single infectious agent. Are you sickened by the fact that 25 years later that statement still has not changed?
Well, in between, we had a little AIDS there, and they were number one, but now the AIDS community did so well with AIDS that it's no longer number one. So TB's back with number one.
Distinction we
want. Of course, that's really very depressing. And the other thing is that what's the WHO data? What's the 5-year survival rate of MDR TB? 50%.
Yep.
Well, what was the rate of TB cure before drugs were invented? 50%. So hell, we haven't made much progress there either.
So Lee, you're
depressed. Oh, Lee, don't be so depressed.
I was going to say, Lee, you're depressing the hell out of us. So I got to ask you a couple of questions here, real quick.
We can't end on such a depressed.
Exactly. Let me ask you, Lee.
We got to be optimistic.
Lee, you've had 5 decades of advocating for TB, right? Give me your highlight.
Wow, that's you should have let me prepare that one.
And don't give me about the barbecue in Memphis or something. I know that's where you're going with this one.
No, actually, the fact is that we have that most people know how to spell TB.
Even infectious disease specialists, I think, right?
Yes, and right? when I started, no one knew how to spell TB, and it wasn't just me. There was a whole lot of people who think as I do and do these kind of things. And I think the other thing that's, and I haven't thought about this, as I said, but there still is a division of tuberculosis elimination at the CDC. Now, I worry that might change. There still is a global tuberculosis program at WHO, which also might change with the new director general coming in. But for the time being, that's amazing that those are still there, that someone in their wisdom said, hey, why don't we combine, all infectious disease or something like that, and that then no one will pay attention to TB, because who gets...
Karen, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Because who gets TB? Poor people and minority groups.
So Lee, let me ask you a question. I just want to, are you surprised that 25 years ago that what you talked about might be coming true? Is that surprising, disappointing?
I think it's disappointing. I think it's not surprising. I think that, it's good for people to say, oh, Reichman said that. So it's good. It's good for my legacy, but that's a selfish, of course. But no, I think these things are all predictable, and I think it's unfortunate that we can predict exactly the way society is going to respond to these kind of things.
So Lee, what's going to be the biggest breakthrough in the next 25 years for TB?
A vaccine. Everybody says a vaccine. Sure, a vaccine. We talk about the 12-dose regimen. I would take a 2-dose regimen might be better than a 12-dose regimen.
And Karen,
TB treatment.
Yeah, let me ask you, Karen. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Depot TB treatment. You get one shot and it lasts for 3 months.
Yep. And let me ask you a question, Karen, and then we're getting close, but I want to ask you a question, Karen. On the other hand, you look back 25 years and you look back now, I think you've seen a lot of changes. You have to be proud of those changes. Your work really did stimulate and really call to arms what had been changed there. I know it's not perfect, but things are better, right?
Oh, of course things are better. I mean, they're better in this country. That's, whether they'll start to slide back or not, I don't know. And as I said before, I'd still focus on the immigrants and figure out how can we help them, how can we reach them, what's the best way, since more than 2/3 of the TB in this country is among immigrants. Until we started having the new politics of the Trump administration, I thought this was possible. We would be able to reach immigrants. Now I'm a little bit scared that it's going to be difficult. But the international scene is obviously much worse. And that, to me, bigger numbers, people still dying, as Lee said, it's the number one cause of death now from an infectious disease. It's beating out HIV. So somehow we managed to treat all these people with antiretrovirals, thank God, but we're not doing such a hot job with TB. So I think that's very, very key, that we need to focus on that as well, both internationally, overseas, and within the United States. Those people who got TB in the countries they came from and, deserve to be diagnosed early and treated.
I agree. Well, look, it's 2:30. This has been amazing. I want to tell you, Karen, I really first want to thank you for your work, and I want you to know how you really stimulated at least 2 generations after you, to continue TB and give people, to be honest with you, the bravery, the strength, and the desire to report what's going on and to point the way to how to get better. So I can't thank you enough for joining us today and for everything you've done. I want to thank you. And Lee, on the other hand, I want to thank you for taking it and taking what Karen and Jay did and then putting it onto a megaphone and shouting it out, and not only shouting this out, but for 5 decades shouting about tuberculosis. And I just want to thank you, and I think on behalf of the whole TB community, us TB nerds, I want to thank you for what you've done for TB, and what we look forward to is everything you're going to do in the future. So Karen, Lee, thank you so much for today, and most importantly, thank you for what you've done, and please don't stop. We need a whole new generation and generation and generation. You need to keep teaching, both of you.